The Pacific Ocean rarely gives back what it takes. But on the morning of October 4th, a local beachcomber walking the foggy coastline of Cape Haven, Oregon, noticed a faint blinking green light in the wet sand. It was a smartwatch. The screen was cracked, but the device was still sealed in a heavy-duty waterproof casing. When investigators powered it up, they expected to find the owner's name. Instead, they found a digital heartbeat, a heart rate log that recorded a perfectly healthy rhythm at 4 to 12 a.m., and then a sudden massive spike, followed by a complete flatline at 4:14 a.m. The watch belonged to a woman who had supposedly left town on a ferry 3 days earlier. A woman whose perfectly packed suitcase was sitting untouched in her apartment. Investigators were no longer looking for a missing person. They were looking for whoever stopped that heartbeat. Chapter 1. The Last Normal Day. 34-year-old Clara Lynwood lived her life by the tides. She was a senior marine biologist at the Cape Haven Oceanic Institute. Clara was brilliant, fiercely independent, and completely dedicated to her research. Every morning, long before the sun came up, she took a small aluminum boat out to the coastal tide pools to collect water samples. She was on the verge of the biggest breakthrough of her career. Clara had spent 3 years preparing a presentation for a massive federal grant, a grant that would secure millions for her department. Her colleagues described her as exhausted but excited. On the morning of October 1st, Clara followed her exact routine. She woke up at 3:30 a.m. She made a thermos of green tea. She walked down to the marina and untied her boat. Security cameras captured her navigating out of the harbor. But Clara never came back for her 9 a.m. lab meeting. She never answered her emails. And when her assistant went to Clara's apartment that afternoon, the door was locked. Everything seemed perfectly normal, except for one glaring detail. Chapter 2. The Empty Mooring. By nightfall, the Cape Haven police were involved. They started at the marina. Clara's slip was empty. Her aluminum boat was gone. Most people assume the worst. The Oregon coast is notorious for sudden squalls and hidden rocks. The Coast Guard launched a search and rescue operation, assuming Clara had suffered a tragic boating accident. But 2 days later, the Coast Guard found Clara's boat. It was drifting peacefully in a sheltered cove, 5 miles south of her usual research spot. The motor was raised, the anchor was neatly stowed, and sitting perfectly centered on the bench seat was Clara's bright yellow waterproof equipment case. Investigators opened the case expecting to find her research logs. Instead, it was completely empty, except for a single piece of paper taped to the inside lid. It was a ferry ticket to Seattle, dated for the afternoon of October 1st. The narrative immediately shifted. Had Clara staged an accident to walk away from her stressful life? Chapter 3. The Inner Circle. To understand why a dedicated scientist might abandon her life's work, detectives looked closely at the people in Clara's orbit. They began with Seth Miller. Seth was Clara's ex-boyfriend. He was a commercial fisherman who knew the local waters better than anyone. Their breakup 6 months prior had been messy. Friends said Seth struggled to accept that Clara prioritized her career over their relationship. And strangely, Seth's fishing trawler had been docked at the same marina as Clara's small boat. Next, investigators spoke to Maya Brooks. Maya was Clara's ambitious lab assistant. If Clara disappeared, Maya stood to take over the day-to-day operations of the research project. During her interview, Maya was visibly nervous. She told police that Clara had been incredibly paranoid in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, frequently changing the passwords on her computers. Finally, there was Dr. Arthur Vance. No, not Vance. Dr. Arthur Sterling. He was the director of the Oceanic Institute and Clara's longtime mentor. Sterling was devastated. He told detectives that Clara was like a daughter to him. He insisted that Clara would never voluntarily abandon her research just days before the federal grant committee arrived. 3 people, 3 different relationships with the victim. But the physical evidence was about to contradict all of their statements. Chapter 4. The ferry ticket contradiction. Detectives focused on the ferry ticket found inside the waterproof case. It seemed like a clear message. Clara had left for Seattle. But a seasoned detective quickly realized something was wrong. The ticket was for the Pacific Express ferry, departing Cape Haven at 3 p.m. The problem was the date. The Pacific Express had suspended its afternoon routes 2 weeks earlier for winter maintenance. There was no 3 p.m. Enid's. There was no 3 p.m. ferry. Clara, who crossed that water constantly, would have known that. Whoever bought that ticket online and taped it inside the case didn't know the local schedules. They were trying to build a false narrative. They were trying to buy time. Chapter 5. The digital heartbeat. The false ticket changed the investigation from a missing person case to a suspected homicide. Then, the beachcomber found Clara's smartwatch up on the sand. Digital forensic specialists managed to extract the encrypted data. It provided a horrifying timeline. At 3:45 a.m., Clara's heart rate was elevated, consistent with driving a small boat. At 4 a.m., the GPS showed her boat stopping at a secluded stretch of the coastline. At 4:12 a.m., her heart rate spiked to 160 beats per minute. Then, it plummeted to 0. But the GPS data provided one more crucial piece of information. At the exact moment Clara's heart stopped, her watch recorded a connection to a secondary device via Bluetooth. Someone else was on that beach with her. Someone carrying a smartphone. Shh. Chapter 6. The Bleach Protocol. Suspicion heavily focused on Seth Miller. The timeline fit. As a commercial fisherman, Seth was awake and working at the docks during those early morning hours. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Seth's trawler. When they boarded the vessel, the smell of industrial bleach was overpowering. Seth had scrubbed the entire deck. When questioned, Seth became extremely defensive. He claimed he had just brought in a heavy catch and was doing routine cleaning. Crime scene technicians used luminol on the deck. It glowed bright blue. There was blood everywhere. They rushed the samples to the lab for DNA testing. Seth was brought into an interrogation room and read his rights. But 48 hours later, the lab results returned. The blood on Seth's boat wasn't human. It belonged to halibut. Seth was telling the truth about his catch. He was a false lead, born from terrible timing and a defensive personality. Chapter 7. The Wi-Fi breakthrough. Investigators had to go back to the Bluetooth connection recorded by Clara's watch. They couldn't identify the specific phone, but they knew it was searching for a connection at 4:12 a.m. A detective decided to look at the network logs at the Oceanic Institute. If the killer worked with Clara, perhaps their phone automatically connected to the lab's Wi-Fi later that morning. They pulled the Institute's server records. At 5:15 a.m., 1 hour after Clara's watch flatlined, a smartphone connected to the Institute's private network. It was a device registered to Dr. Arthur Sterling. Detectives pulled Sterling's alibi. He had claimed he was asleep at his home 20 miles inland until 7:00 a.m., but the network logs placed him in his office before the sun came up. Why would the grieving mentor lie about where he was? Chapter 8. The shadow data armed with a warrant. Cybercrime investigators seized Dr. Sterling's computers and Clara's locked hard drives. They finally bypassed Clara's new passwords. Inside her private files, they didn't find research on tide pools. They found an internal audit. For the last 5 years, Dr. Sterling had been fabricating his research data to secure ongoing funding from private donors. His entire career was built on falsified numbers. Clara had discovered the fraud. Her files contained drafts of an email addressed to the Federal Grant Committee, exposing Sterling's lies. She had planned to send it the day she disappeared. Dr. Sterling wasn't a mentor protecting his brightest student. He was a fraud protecting his legacy. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. Detectives brought Dr. Arthur Sterling into the interrogation room. They didn't yell. They simply placed the network logs and Clara's audit files on the table. Sterling looked at the documents. His professional composure dissolved. He confessed that he had confronted Clara at the docks before she left on her morning route. He begged her to keep quiet, promising her shared credit on future patents. When she refused and boarded her boat, Sterling followed her in his own skiff. He intercepted her at the secluded beach. The confrontation turned violent. Sterling panicked. He staged the drifting boat and bought the fake ferry ticket online to create a distraction. But he didn't realize Clara's smartwatch was recording his proximity, and he didn't realize that a broken ferry schedule would unravel his entire plan. Chapter 10. The tide comes in. Dr. Arthur Sterling pled guilty to second-degree murder and widespread fraud. He was sentenced to 50 years in state prison. His published research was formally retracted, sending shockwaves to the scientific community. Maya Brooks, Clara's assistant, presented the genuine research to the federal committee. They secured the grant. The newly funded lab was officially renamed the Clara Lynwood Marine Research Center. The ocean never gave back Clara's remains, but the people of Cape Haven visit the coastline differently now. They remember the dedicated scientist who refused to compromise the truth, and they remember that no matter how deep a secret is buried, the tide eventually brings it to the surface.